Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have David Autor with us from MIT. Hi, David.
Hey there. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Great, David, to have you. And David will talk about the unexpected competition at work in the low-wage economy. It's joint work with Aaron Dubé and Annie McGrew. And we're very excited to learn more today what's happening currently with low-wage income, whether it's compressing or not, and why. And he will tell us all about it. And we're also very grateful for answering the poll questions. And let me today just go to the poll questions directly. And the first question was, which group has seen the largest nominal wage gains during the COVID recovery? Is it older college grades? That's what 29% thought of you. Younger college graduates, 9% only. Older high school grads, 20%, and young high school grads, 41%. Second question was, the inflation losses are not offset by wage gains for what group of workers? For high wage workers, 31% thought this. For low wage workers, 24%. And for either, 44%. So the majority thought 44% thought not for either. And fully offset for both, it's only 1% thought this. The third question was, the wage growth is faster among job stayers. That's what 5% thought. Faster among job changers, that's 89%, so almost 90%. Or comparable for both groups, 5%. So the big majority said for job changers, it's the biggest one. And the final question was, has the market for low-wage workers has the demand or supply curve shifted outwards or inwards, depending whether the demand or supply? That's 41% thought. Or has it become more competitive? So elasticity of labor supply has changed. The monopoly power of labor supply has changed, 59%. So 40-60 roughly. So that's that's the outcome. So let me give you a few thoughts on my own, and then we pass on the floor to David. So after the COVID crisis, the recovery, we had the skill premium. And you could think of if the blue-collar workers actually got a higher wage increase than the white-collar workers. One, it could be that actually white-collar workers are just compensated for something different. So now they can, instead of getting higher wages, they can do working from home, they get more flexibility. So rather than getting dollars, they're getting some flexibility or some other compensation in form of non-pecuniary compensation. And, they have essentially more the desire to get more flexibility working from home. And, there's a shift in the preferences among the workers. There's a search for meaning. What do I do in life? And perhaps I don't want to work so much anymore. And of course, we also have a lot of the labor supply side in the service sector in particular. We have long COVID problems, and that's, makes it harder to rebuild the labor participation, which we see rebuilding, but it takes longer. So it's labor shortages everywhere. So the question is a COVID premium coming there? The next slide, I would like to talk a little bit about skill premium and inflation. You can sometimes, there's the argument made that whenever the economy recovers and the workers will gain on bargaining power and will get higher wages, the central bank steps in with higher interest rates and cools down the economy, and with it cools down the bargaining powers of the workers as well. But if you think about it, it's connected to the wage price spiral. Of course, the central bank is concerned that higher prices will also translate into higher wages. And the central bank wants to constrain the wage growth in order to get also inflation under control. And primarily, you would like to constrain the wage growth of the high MPC workers, the high marginal propensity to consume households. And that actually hits the poor much more than the rich. So if you look at the wage price spiral across different workers, for rich workers, which have potentially a low marginal propensity to consume, versus high income workers, which have a low marginal propensity to consume, versus poor workers, which have a high marginal propensity to consume, there might be a differentiation there. On the other hand, if you hike interest rates, you also hurt the growth stocks. And that actually we saw already that led to a revaluation of the tech sector, that led to a lot of layoffs. And that might actually lower the skill premium because high income tech workers that might get less of the income. So that can go either way, but the inflation plays into place there as well. Let me refer finally to the skill premium during the German inflation in the 1920s and our hyperinflation. So I have a recent paper which is coming out on the financial Phillips curve. And one component is what you see very clearly is when inflation is high, you see low skilled workers, real wages go up while high skilled workers is not going up. So there's a clear way that low skilled workers in the high inflation environment, they actually benefit compared to the low skilled workers benefit compared to the high skilled workers. But it's not the case anymore. Once you go to hyperinflation, this differentiation is going away. So it's only for high inflation, but not for hyperinflation. So with this, I pass on the floor to David, and we're looking forward to your presentation, whether we see some unexpected compression, and is competition really at work for low wage income, for the low wage economy. So you still
great, thank you so much. So I should say, by the way, I didn't know if we were going to score the quiz, but in 3 or 4 cases, the modal answer was the correct answer, and you'll see going forward. But let me put up my slides. So the wisdom of crowds very much at work here. This is, so I mentioned, as Markus mentioned, this is a joint work with Arne Dubé, who's professor at UMass Amherst, and Annie McGrew, who's a promising PhD student at that same institution. And I, during the pandemic, I wish I had actually thought to bring the screenshot with me, wrote an article about the post-pandemic labor market, in which I said too few low-wage jobs. I was quite pessimistic about the trajectory, and I thought, because of the reallocation out of cities, because of the decline for demand for in-person services, we would actually see a slack labor market for low-wage workers. And I couldn't have been more wrong, I'm proud to say. And in fact, what we've seen is something quite the opposite. And the question of this paper is to try to understand what's going on, not from the macroeconomic perspective of why has demand risen or supply fallen, but how is that changing the way that labor markets are operating? And in particular, how is it interacting with or changing the nature of competition? So the textbook model of perfect competition that you're all familiar with is static. There's no unemployment, there's no labor shortage. Wages automatically adjust to the value marginal product of labor. Evidence on labor market competition tells us something different. We see, there's now a vast and growing body of work that says employers don't face perfectly elastic labor supply for a variety of reasons. It's not that they're, one company towns, but just, workers have preferences, there's distances, there's imperfect information. And in such a market, similar workers are paid differently just due to frictional wage inequality. In particular, each firm has some labor market power. There's a set of workers who will work in some wage range, and so they can adjust prices and quantities simultaneously. And so we want to ask, how does a tightening of the labor market interact with the state of competition? And we think that the post-pandemic labor market, or the maybe post is too strong a word, but the current labor market offers an opportunity to find out how things change. And we're going to distinguish between 2 notions of labor market tightness. One is, starting from perfect competition, labor demand shifts out relative to labor supply or vice versa. Employment and wages rise. There's no change in competitive conditions. You're moving from one Pareto efficient allocation to another. However, starting from imperfect competition, it's possible the labor supply curve becomes more elastic. Job changes become more responsive to wage levels, and workers reallocate from bad to good jobs, or doing the same thing and yet earning a higher wage, working at a different employer. And this distinction has normative implications, because in the latter case, if we're actually seeing reallocation due to a change in the elasticity of labor supply, that would actually mean workers are moving from less productive to more productive employers. And the wage gains are not simply a transfer. Actually, they reflect in part gains in surplus from improved efficiency. So it matters, this distinction. So here's the kind of plan of attack of my talk. I'm going to start with some unexpected facts, a sharp reversal in inequality driven by rising wages among low-paid workers. I'm going to offer a simple conceptual model, actually 2 versions of it, a graphical one and then a more formal one, that tries to distinguish between changes in demand versus changes in competition, or what those look like. Then I present 4 pieces of evidence that may inform this. One is just descriptively rising transition rates, showing you that that's going on and showing you labor market tightness and how it relates to wage growth. Then I want to look at who's quitting, and particularly the role of low pay. And the question I want to ask there is, has the quit elasticity risen? In other words, the probability that someone separates from a low wage job relative to any other job. And then if so, why? Is there actually a payoff to job change? In other words, for the quit elasticity to be meaningful, it needs to be the case that people are moving to better jobs. They want to show evidence on whether that is occurring. Of course, no seminar talking about wage growth would be complete if I didn't also talk a bit about inflation. So I will talk about real wage growth versus nominal wage growth and show how those are connected as well. And then finally, I'll wrap up. So first, I know you guys don't want a long literature review, but let me just make a few points. There is a literature going back on the effects of tight labor markets on earnings, on job switching, on job satisfaction. So unemployment, the cyclicality of job switching, well-known work on the high-pressure labor market of the 1990s by Katz and Kruger, and work thinking specifically about quit elasticities and job flows. So our work is certainly related to the work by Bassier, Dubé, and Naidu, by Mascarini and Postel-Vinay. I think what we bring that's distinct is a focus on this period of sharp change that allows us to inform some of these implications. There's also, of course, a growing body of work I already mentioned on monopsony power, and a little bit of work on how labor market pressure interacts with that we're contributing to. I will not spend time on it, but there's also work on wage pressure and price pressure. There's a working paper by two Berkeley PhD students, Serrato and Gitti, that shows that labor market pressure does appear to be related to price changes at the state level. And I'll just say, we benchmark our results against theirs and confirm our results or confirm their results. So we're definitely in the same ballpark. Finally, there's a bunch of recent work on the post-pandemic labor market that we're related to. One is about rising remote work, as Markus mentioned, and I'm just going to be talking about wages here, not about quality of work. And we could have a discussion about that. I think they make a very important point that kind of job quality has probably improved for high wage workers who can work from home, and probably gotten worse for lower paid workers, because we all saw the horror stories about what happens in airplanes and what happens in overcrowded restaurants and so on. So maybe jobs have gotten harder. I'm looking at pecuniary compensation, but it's worth thinking about that. There's also work on missing workers and how much they contribute to what's going on. There's actually a very nice recent paper this week by Ayshaghal Sahin and Bart Hobden, just saying there actually aren't as many missing workers as you think. And then I will finally talk about inflation inequality in very end, just by referencing the recent paper by Xavier Geravel. And I think that relates to interpreting what we found here. But let me start with just a kind of a quick helicopter tour of some facts that we found quite striking. One is on employment and the other is on wages. So let me just start with participation. Participation rates plummeted during the pandemic, not surprisingly, and that's well known, but they have risen. So employment rates have almost fully rebounded, and the labor force fell and then grew again. So this would imply actually the unemployment rate is slightly lower now than it was immediately here, because the employment rate has risen even more than the labor force participation rate. If we look by education, the pandemic was an incredibly efficient machine for creating inequality. Employment fell much more among the low educated, but it's actually rebounded just as strongly so this is high school, this is people with some college, this is some people with a college degree. So those groups that saw these incredibly steep falls have seen equally and correspondingly steep rebounds, which was certainly not what I was predicting. If we look by occupational level, and I think that makes a lot of sense to do so given how different occupations were affected so differently, and look at low versus medium versus high wage occupations, and these low wage occupations are really many of them are going to be personal services, right? Food service, cleaning, security, transportation, things like that, even home health aides. Those saw by far the fall of 17 percentage points relative to their start of pre-pandemic level, and again have rebounded just as strongly in correspondence to their decline. So this reconvergence is really remarkable. And yeah, really remarkable. Now we turn to wages. That was just employment. So this shows you as our best estimate. So these are nominal wage gains over the 36-month period from July 2019 through September 2022. This is the most recent 24 months. This is the most recent 12 months. When I say most recent, by the way, I should say our data go through September of 2022. We are using the current population survey for our estimate. The current population survey has the virtue of being recent and representative. It has the disadvantage of being a relatively small sample relative to the big data that we're used to nowadays. And it doesn't have much of a longitudinal component, which limits what we can do. But it's a great place, we think, to start on this. So what you see is that if there was a lot of real wage growth if we look over 36 months, particularly below the median. If we look at 24 months, it's only below the 20th percentile. And if we look over the last 12 months, it's even only even smaller fraction of the distribution seems to be gaining. So the bottom 15% of the distribution has seen real wage gains even over the last year. Another way to see that, by the way, is here we calculate regional, we calculate wage levels using consumer price index inflators that are metro area specific. And so we assign everyone the CPI in their metro area, or if they're not in the metro area, we assign them a rest of state level. And so this tries to actually adjust for, because prices are rising at different levels in different places. And you reach much the same conclusion, slightly more favorable. The bottom quartile, it appears, is experiencing real wage gains, not enormous ones, but real wage gains over last year, even adjusting for local cost of living. Now, I should say, this is the cost of living, assuming everyone in the area faces the same cost of living. You may be worried that, different components of that basket are, food, energy, transportation, housing are moving differently. So it's worth thinking about the inflation inequality, which I'll talk about at the very end, referencing the work by Xavier Gervel.
Can I ask you something, David, about this figure?
Yeah.
It seems like, is it because the first figure to the left is over 3 years, so the difference is bigger?
That's correct. These are annualized.
Oh, they're annualized. Okay.
Yeah, I apologize. They're annualized. I should have said that. But this is over 3 years. This is the most recent 2, and this is the most recent 1. Right. So
then it means like the 2019 effect was the most of the compression effect was biggest on 2019 compared to 2019 to 2020.
It really would have been 2020 to 2021 is where that's really coming from. But yes.
Okay.
That's right. So it's definitely the case that there was a lot of compression nominally and not much inflation initially. And now the compression has largely plateaued, but inflation has accelerated.
Is it important to keep this in mind that compression has plateaued recently?
It is. I think it is worth keeping that in mind. I mean, it's not reversed, right? Yes. We are at a different place, but it's not getting more pronounced. But even so, this is, as you can see in this figure, so these are real wage trends at the 10th, 50th, and 90th percent of the distribution, right? And you can see that the 10th is actually rising here. I'll come back to that in one sec. The 50th and 90th are kind of moving in parallel, and then there's this big jump of about 7 percentage points. This is in real terms, adjusting for inflation, and all of these we are using monthly CPI to do this. And then the 10th has basically been holding its own, right, since the middle of 2020. The median has fallen, and the 9th percentile has fallen a little more as well. So this is both a real and nominal compression of the wage distribution in the sense that
this happened, so this differentiation happened way before the labor hoarding story started and all that, I guess. No?
Yeah, I mean, this kicks in, like this jump happens as soon as the lockdown ends, essentially. And then, but inflation kicks in, and then the 10th percentile continues to be in some sense compensated. And these other quantiles not as much. Not that there's no wage increase, but it's not growing as fast as measured inflation. One thing I want to actually call your attention to is you might be looking at this 10th percentile and saying, oh, I see, well, that was already happening. This is just sort of, we weren't paying attention to, but the pandemic just kind of drew our attention to a line that we were overlooking. It turns out that was only, this rising 10% was only happening in states that were raising their minimum wage. And it was not happening in states that were not increasing their minimum wage. But they both do the same thing after the pandemic, which is the 10 percentile really jumps. And I just can't resist showing you this figure. This shows you the relationship between the 10th percentile, the change in the 10th percentile between 2015 and 2019, and the change in the log minimum wage at the state level. And it's really remarkably strong. So there was a lot of, there's been, and this has been carefully studied by Autor and Dubé among others, my co-author Autor and Dubé, the minimum wage has had, 104, there have been 140 state minimum wage increases since 1980, only 2 federal ones, maybe 3. And they really have a lot of bite at this point. But so just so you don't think this is a kind of pre-existing trend, when we look at the states where we could see the unmasked 10th percentile, it wasn't really rising. It certainly wasn't rising faster than any other percentile. If we look by occupational level, you can see this again. These are lowest paid, medium paid, highest paid. We saw they had these quantity rebounds. They also have these price rebounds. And we also see a reduction in the Black Hispanic wage penalty on the order. So if you normalize that at 1, maybe we should have normalized it at 0, it declines by 5 to 7 percentage points. In the interest of time, I'll focus in very shortly. The wage growth is also fast if we look among the young under 25, then 25 to 39. And then if we look at the older young who are 40 and over, and even the oldest young who are 55 and over, we can see the wage growth is not as sharp. So all signs point to people, towards the bottom of the earnings distribution. And here I finally distinguish high school versus college grads with who are under age 40. So these are high school and below. These are bachelor's and above. So I'm not including some college in this figure. And for most of what I do, I'm just going to contrast high school age 40 below versus BA, the complementary group. But so both, if we look at the older workers, they both experience this jump, but we don't see a separation between them. There's no reduction in the gap. And of course, they experience a lot more erosion due to inflation than these two younger groups. Okay, great. So those are the unexpected aspects of the compression, or at least the compression itself. Maybe you were expecting it. I was not. Now let me offer a kind of a... Can
you give us some perspective? How big is that in your view? Is this a huge...
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, good. Thanks very much for asking that. Yeah, this is really large. Let's see, we put a way to put it. How much... I should know this number off the top of my head because I've done so much work on it, but I can't, off the top of my head, I'm going to say that the 50-10, expanded between, let's say, 1980 and 2000 by on the order of maybe 15 log points. That would be, so it's a very large, so it's 15% increase in that gap. And so this is undoing maybe a third of it. Okay. In very short order, and maybe I may even be overstating the extent of the expansion. So I should have more statistics on that. So thank you for asking that question. But this is dramatic, and it also should bear in mind we're at the end. What we hope is the end of 4 decades of rising inequality. Right, since the beginning of the 1980s, we've seen by any metric wages of the less educated at the bottom of the distribution, measured by job stability, measured by fringe benefits. Conditions have relatively deteriorated for lower wage workers, and in real terms for men with high school or lower education. So this is extraordinary.
Do you look for men and women separately too? No.
In this paper, we do not. We will do that, but haven't done that so far, and but we could and we should. In fact, we should be doing that. Okay.
Just to link it to Angus Deaton and Ann Case.
That's right. And the deaths of despair component. Yeah. So we should. And in fact, the growth of inequality has been very pronounced in both among both sexes. However, only men have seen the real earnings declines and also the steep labor force declines at the bottom. So yeah, you make an excellent point. We should have figures on that already. Okay. So I want to now distinguish rising demand from increasing competition. So let me start with your Econ 101 book, figure. So this is just, I'm going to imagine an inward shift in labor supply. because it is the case that labor supply, there is less labor being supplied now than prior to the pandemic. There's also an outward shift in labor demand, but we only need one of those. So let's imagine labor supply shifts in a static model. This is the labor market viewed from 1,000 feet up, not from the perspective of an individual employer. Quantity of employment falls, equilibrium wage rises. If you think of this from the perspective of an individual employer in this perfectly competitive labor market, right? As far as they're concerned, there's no upward sloping labor supply because they're just atomistic on this huge curve. And so the wage, the equilibrium wage rises and quantity employed falls. Very familiar. Now let's consider another setting where firms face somewhat upward labor supply. Now, this does not have to be an exotic setting where you have a company town where everybody works for one employer. It just needs to be that every firm notices that, well, if it pays a little more people show up and apply for its job, right? So the firm is, of course, pricing on the demand curve or the marginal revenue product of labor curve. This is the labor supply curve in log terms. So this is the marginal cost of labor. There's a constant gap given by the fact that you have to raise wages of inframarginal workers as you raise the wage of the marginal worker, i.e. I can't just pay the last guy in the door more. The assumption is I need to pay everybody a bit more if I raise the wage. And so the firm chooses it chooses the quantity, it chooses its quantity by equating the marginal cost or the marginal revenue product of labor, and then it chooses the wage that calls forth that number of workers. And so this gap is the markup, right? So this is the equilibrium amount of labor demanded and the wage paid. So now imagine there is a rotation of the labor supply curve. It becomes more elastic, shallower, right? Well, what is that going to do for this low wage employer? Well, again, it's going to price along its marginal revenue. It's going to choose quantity along the marginal revenue product of labor curve. It's going to choose the wage to call forth that quantity of workers. And for this firm, we see a further reduction in employment or reduction in employment and a rise in the wage. So nothing exotic there. Now consider a higher wage employer. And this firm is, again, doing the same thing. It chooses its quantity according to the marginal cost of labor. It chooses its wage to call forth that number of workers. And now we have this rotation. And what the rotation does is it, of course, on the one hand, it makes labor more expensive for the firm at the margin. On the other hand, it means that the firm has less inframarginal wage setting power. It doesn't have to raise wages as much when it raises its wages a bit because the labor supply curve is more elastic. If this were perfectly linear, it would have no market power whatsoever. And so in that case, that firm could see a slight increase in employment and a slight increase in the wage simultaneously. And this is sort of the same magic of how a minimum wage can actually, in some cases, raise employment and wages simultaneously by reducing the exercise of monopsony power. So in this model, what you might expect is that if firms are competing each with some market power, when the labor supply curve becomes steeper, the low wage employers will just lose workers and pay more, and the high wage employers may gain workers and pay more. So we would see a reallocation of workers from low wage to high wage employers without necessarily changing what they're doing, but just a movement across employers. Markus, do you have a question?
I just wanted to ask you, because is it in the literature, I guess it's normal to assume that the firm has all the price setting power or the wage setting power and the worker doesn't, or the bargaining power is totally on the firm's side here now?
So the literature is moving so fast, I don't want to say what is normal. It has become conventional to think that basically workers are on their supply curve and firms are choosing the wage. And this is in kind of these IO style models where the labor supply curve comes from preference, and the firm is just the last worker is indifferent and the others are not. But it wouldn't qualitatively change if bargaining power was splitting the difference between workers and firms on this.
But you also make certain assumption on the elasticities for high productive, high wage workers compared to low productive, low wage workers.
Right. So we're not here. There's just labor. I'm not distinguishing among skill levels. In the formal model I'll give you in a minute, there is a little more of that.
Okay.
But before I go deeper into that, let me say, you might say, well, why would this is what could happen if the labor supply curve became more elastic and the labor market were somewhat monopolistic, why would it become more elastic, right? So I will give you 4 plausible explanations. One is that there were numerous involuntary separations during the pandemic. So quite plausibly, this has reduced workers' attachment to employers. It's raised their foot looseness. It's just gotten people used to the idea of changing jobs. A second possibility, and when I list these possibilities, I'm going to be clear, I'm not going to be able to test them. I won't be able to distinguish them. I'm only suggesting why this might be true. Second is liquidity. Pandemic savings are not yet exhausted. It's easier for people to change jobs when they're not living hand to mouth. There's less risk involved. A third is potentially word of mouth itself. Everyone knows that everyone else is moving to a better job, right? And if we all believe that everyone's going to hold out for a higher wage, that will work, right? That will effectively increase our bargaining power. And then a fourth possibility is in the formal theory, this actually will drop out of a canonical job ladder model, a model where people search for new jobs while on the job and take higher wage offers. So Marcus, you tell me, I can spend 5-7 minutes going through this model, or I can skip it, give it in the interest of time, whatever you prefer.
Let's spend 5 minutes because there are also some questions about, how should we think of the rotation of the LS curve and all this. And I think this would explain that. So
excellent. Happy to do that.
There are several questions.
Great.
Yes.
So here, welcome to the frat party part of the talk with the Greek letters. Separations are S in this job search ladder model. They're a function of the wage. There's an exogenous outflow to non-employment. There's exogenous E to E shocks where you just move to another job, maybe even a lower wage job. This is what people call the Godfather shock, an offer you cannot refuse. And then there are these endogenous job changes. What they are is lambda E is your contact rate with outside employers. That's actually an internally determined parameter of the model. And then F of W is the cumulative distribution of wages. So 1 minus F of W is all the wages that are above the wage that you're being paid, right? So you effectively in this model, you have some probability of having contact, and then your probability of getting a higher wage, conditional on contact, is proportional to how low your wage is. So these are the 3 forces giving rise to separations, the latter 2 of which are E to E separations, employment to employment, job to job. And notice, by the way, this lambda E times 1 minus F of W, these are to better paying jobs. So these are not random moves, they're directed moves towards better paying jobs. And the separation rate depends on how high into better jobs depends on how low you are in the distribution. So the elasticity, the EDE elasticity with respect to an increase in the wage, right, is the shape of this outside offer function divided by the initial level, which is in part a function of the exogenous separation rate, the frequency of Godfather shocks. So as the wage rises, the share of flows that are from lower wage to higher wage actually increases, because if this rho is constant, right, then the proportion of that are these positive shocks will be rising. Now, where does lambda E come from? This is the contact rate. Well, it's going to be a function of job searchers and vacancies. And so the way we've written, and this is standard Burnett-Mortensen, or going back all the way to Diamond-Mortensen, Prisarides, is a constant returns to scale matching function. So it depends on the ratio of vacancies to job searchers. The higher is that ratio, the tighter is the labor market, the higher the contact rate will be higher. So theta is this tightness measure. And we have job seekers that are coming out of both the unemployed and the employed. But as the labor market tightens, more of them will be coming out of the employed, meaning more of them will be the seekers, because there'll just be fewer unemployed as there is. So the implication is this theta is monotonically rising in both your conventional measure of tightness, which is just vacancies to unemployment, and in this broader definition of tightness, which includes all job searchers, including the people who are searching on the job. So the key points is that as either we see an increase in demand, which is basically a movement of that wage distribution, that F distribution over, or a lower unemployment rate, the employment to employment separation elasticity is going to rise, right? So we're going to see more job changes. And it's going to happen more at the bottom of the distribution because there's more people who have room to go up from there, because more their probability of getting a higher shock, a higher wage offer, is intrinsically higher. Now, we haven't told you where W is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
You can endogenize this in the model and make it a function of productivity. It doesn't change the analytics of the model. So the main thing this model says is, as tightness increases, more of the people leaving a job will be leaving because they can get a higher wage, and more of the overall search in the labor market will be coming from people who are on the job already. And so it naturally, or unnaturally, depending on how you think of the model, gives rise to this tightness changing the elasticity of labor supply that employers face.
Okay.
Okay. All right, great. So now I want
just to make sure that it's always homogeneous, totally homogeneous. There's no differentiation between high skill, low skill. It's always the same skill set.
That's correct. This is homogeneous. So you could think of, when I say these wage offers, you could think of these wages given to people the same skill level, right? You could sort of think of this as a residual wage, right? And so, yeah, you could then say, well, look, there's a market for computer programmers, there's a market for burger flippers, and they face different F of W. That's right. So it's not, it says within that group, within a group, the lower wage workers will be more likely to separate, and that separation elasticity will rise as the labor market tightens. It doesn't really make a strong prediction for which groups that would be, right? Whether that's going to be the computer programmers or the burger flippers. It just says within any given group, it will be the lower paid workers who will start doing more of that. Good.
And the inflation aspect it's a pure real model. Now there's inflation aspect.
That's correct. Is it purely a real model? Although actually, no, it's not. Actually, it's not important, because let's say we're all experiencing inflation, right? And all of those FOWs are experiencing inflation. Will I still, right, prefer the higher nominal wage? Okay. Okay, good. So now let me present some evidence on related things. So first, I want to just present evidence on describing the transition rate, rising transition. Then I want to look at how labor market tightness is related to wage growth, which is what we would expect out of a framework like that. The tighter the labor market, the more people are making these transitions, the more we will see upward movement in wages. Then I want to talk about who is quitting, the quit elasticity, and finally the payoff to job change, because obviously quitting wouldn't be useful unless it got you somewhere better. Okay.
So let me just come back to the model, because you said initially you want to make some welfare statements.
Oh, well, okay. Okay, well, the welfare statements are very easy with this model.
Because, yes, okay.
Because it has improved allocative efficiency.
Yes.
Are they easy in this model? Well, sure. Okay, so if I really view these FOWs as reflecting productivity, right, then people are moving to more productive jobs.
Yes.
Right. Now, again, it looks more convincing in the model framework, but in fact, it's totally arbitrary, right? So it's in some sense, this one you can sort of get behind, right? That if I'm working for a terrible, a low paid, unproductive mom and pop setting, and I move to a higher paid, more sophisticated setting, right? That is a gain in productivity accompanied by a gain in wage. In this model, it's assumed that W reflects productivity. So that's also going on, but it's purely by assumption. Okay, great. So the first thing is just transition rates. So this shows you the overall month-to-month job transition rates from the current population survey. So the current population survey, is a incredibly important and well-designed instrument that has limitations. It's been around for more than 70 years. And its panel structure is you see people in the data for 4 months, then they're out of the data for 4 months, then they come back in for 4 more months. That's called the rotation structure. From month to month, if they're asked if they change jobs from the previous month only, but they're only asked about their wage every 4th month that they're in the sample. So what you get to see varies. So you can see job change more easily than you can see wage change, right? So wage change for a person, you can only see over a 1-year interval, right? So if I'm asked about my wage, if I enter January, February, March, April, I'm asked about my wage in April, then they ask me again the following April. So you can see if I change jobs in January, February, February to March, March to April, and then the same the following year, but you can't see my wage changes month to month. that'll become important shortly.
So the pattern here is because of a school year that most of the job changes are in the summer. Is this, or do you read this correctly? Or
yeah, there are more job changes in the summer. Let's see if that seems to be a pattern. Yeah, it is. I do think it partly has to do with the end of school year reshuffle.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's right, then we should see it among high school educated workers, and we see even more of that, at least in 2021, although I guess that can't be distinguished for sure from the pandemic. But we do see among high school educated workers, it's actually about 30% higher. So overall, it's about 15% higher. Among less educated workers, it's risen by a third. So that's a substantial increase in this. And these are monthly job-to-job transition rates. So a 3% monthly job-to-job transition rate, roughly it means a third of people are changing jobs every year among this group. So that's a pretty sizable number. So if we do this, just here's our young high school workers, our kind of primary, our focal group, right? This is the group that's now their job-to-job transition rates are 4% a month, right? Which was pretty steep. If we look at older high school or younger college, it's really, really not as visible. So it is concentrated among this group of workers. So now say, okay, well, how does, so we see more people changing jobs, but how does that relate to wage growth?
So what I'm still puzzled, I can expect that during the pandemic, there was a lot of switching, but you're saying it's even higher now, 2022.
A little bit higher. I mean, so initially it was called the Great Resignation, right? Yeah. And now people call it the Great Reshuffle, yes, right? Yeah. And it does seem to be that and I'll show you in a variety of ways that this really is going on, that people are moving around a lot more. Now, part of it is because, we know they've exited the hospitality sector, for example, but it does seem, and I'll argue that this is the case, or at best evidence, I think it has limitations, but our best evidence is that people are quitting more from low-wage jobs. Okay. So we're going to look at the relationship between labor market tightness and wage growth, right? This is the kind of connection in the formal model I showed you, right? It's the tightness that gives rise to this E to E switching to higher wage jobs, nominal or real. This is just
you also look at, instead of wage growth, any subsidy certain people got during the COVID crisis?
That we're not doing. Now, most of our evidence is about post-COVID. Now, people still have money in the bank.
Yes.
But I mean, there is, fascinating work on that topic for sure. And there was an amazing amount of subsidy. Not that it all went to the people we'd hope it would go to. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to, again, we're limited in the precision of what we can do with the current population survey. That's the downside. We're going to measure labor market tightness in two ways, either as the unemployment rate in a state labor market or the job-to-job separation rate, or we're going to take the average of the two. That's an efficient way to combine them, right, just to power up. We're going to look at the wage growth of, this is not a person level wage growth, it's the wage growth of individuals in state S in time T. As a function of tightness. So we're looking at the change between the first half of 2021 and the last 2 quarters of 2022, or quarters 2 and 3, excuse me, the last 2 quarters of our data. So this is a 15-month period. And we're going to measure tightness in the intervening months, the second half of 2021. And then we're going to have an interaction. So there's a level of tightness that's related to the wage, and then the change in wages related to tightness. And we're going to use wages from person level microdata. We're going to cluster our standards at the state level. We're going to control for a variety of things, education, age group, sex, race, sector, union covered, and even the state COVID death rate, just to make sure that we're not getting something spurious. So first, let me show you what our tightness measures look like, right? This is the red line is the E to E separation rate, the job-to-job separation rate, which measure, and you can see it rises considerably after 2021. The unemployment rate, this is the negative of the unemployment rate, so higher numbers or lower unemployment, right? It was quite low towards the end of the Trump administration, right? That was a very good labor market. And then it rose a lot, meaning, the negative fell. And then it's rebounded. It's basically back where it was. So this contributes to the time series property, the red line, the blue does not. But of course, they do at the state level, they both contribute because there's a lot of cross-state variation. Yep.
Just to get an idea about the separation rate, if I look at the late 90s, is this an outlier what we're observing now? Or
it's a really good question. And this is also on our to-do list, is to go back to the high pressure labor, the roaring 90s, as Katz and as Solo and Kruger referred to them in the book of the high pressure labor market, and see how this compares. We're not making any claim that what we're seeing here is anomalous. Another thing that's anomalous about it happens so fast, and things are really tight, but we don't. This may be what normally happens when we find ourselves in these abnormal conditions, but we rarely get to see that. Now we hope maybe we hope to see more of it, depending on who you are.
Is there any way to measure it? Is this an efficient switch that that move to better? Here, it's in your model, it's always switching within the same sector, but there might be sectoral switches.
Yeah. I'm going to present some evidence on that.
Okay.
Yeah, not fully satisfactory, but we're very much thinking. So, I mean, I think the question you're asking is, are people moving to better types of jobs? Are they moving up the job ladder? Or are they just moving to better employers? Right now, they're both interesting, and they both, in some sense, they're probably both good. But we're going to present evidence that we think most of it's just coming from job to job switch. That's not purely coming from switching sectors, although there is sector switching going on. So people are moving up the sector ladder. But that doesn't seem to account for most of what we're going to see, which we think is, again, consistent with this kind of monopsonistic market in which you could get different wage levels doing the same thing at different firms, not, factor of 2 wage differences, but, 5-10%. So this is the tightness. Just to show you, there's substantial cross-state variation. That's important because if this was just time series, we'd be pretty under-identified, right? So, in some of these older labor markets, less dense labor markets tend to be tighter. But the main thing is that this variation exists. It's not. It's enough to work with.
Do you have an explanation why it's so different across the country, the tightness?
Well, I mean, we know that the lockdown states had a slower recovery, right? So the South in general did better. Here's Ron DeSantis waving at you from the bottom of the figure. And we know some states that have very old populations, like Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, have particularly affected. And then, of course, these are low density states. I don't think anyone's home. So here is the state level wage Phillips curve on average. So it says a 1 unit increase in the standardized measure of unemployment and tightness is associated with a 2.5 log point gain in wages overall at the state level. These are nominal. I want to be clear, this is nominal. This is for the bottom quartile of workers, people who start at the bottom. And this is the other 2 quartiles. So you'll notice it's 5 times as steep. Okay. Here's similarly, if I show you high school under 40 versus all other groups, it's much steeper. In fact, for the older college grads, and for the upper quartiles, it's either 0 or negative. So this is, again, consistent with compression, as we discussed, but the compression is much more powerful in states that have low unemployment and high E/E changes. Now, those are an outcome. I don't want to say one is causing the other, but they're correlated in the way that the model would predict that they would be. We've done lots of oh wow, I'm taking way more time than I think you planned. Okay, we've done lots of cuts of the data. I won't show you any of them.
We can take a little bit more time, don't worry.
So that's the aggregate evidence. And it just says, look, states where we see labor markets tightening, we see more job change. We see, that was tautological. States where the labor market is tightening, we see more wage growth. The wage growth is at the bottom. So who's quitting? So we're going to look at separation rates, and the quit elasticity, the likelihood of leaving as a function of your wage level, is kind of a key measure of labor market power. In fact, in kind of steady state, the quit elasticity and the joiner elasticity, which should be equal to one another, is twice the labor supply elasticity. It's a sort of anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a Manning identity, but basically it says this is related. This is related to how much labor market power firm has. The higher its quit elasticity, the less wage setting power it has. So using the current population survey, we can estimate quits in the 12 months following the first wage observation. So we can either use your own wage and ask whether you change jobs, or we can also use the industry wage premium and ask whether you change jobs. The reason to use the industry wage premium is then we can go month to month. For own wage, we can only go year to year because of the structure of the CPS. And again, we're going to include a bunch of controls and we're going to, so I think that sort of gives you the general picture. I should say
this is a quadratic term there, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we do. We can do it linearly or quadratically, but the job ladder model predicts that the effect would be concentrated at the bottom of the wage distribution. So it does motivate as kind of non-linear relationship, and I'll show you evidence that seems to be going on. But good question. And in the appendix of the non-existent paper, we also have or else in the appendix of the slides, we also have the linear version of this. I should say that using industry and occupation to proxy annual job change, which is standard practice in the current population survey done by the commonly used Atlanta Fed Wage Tracker, suffers from the fact there's lots of false positives and false negatives. So people don't change industry and occupation and do change jobs. People are recorded as having changed industry and occupation and not having changed jobs. Let me qualify. What do I mean by this? Well, they're asked, are you in the same job you were in a month ago? So that we're going to treat that as ground truth. The reason you say, well, why would someone have an industry occupation change if they didn't change jobs? Well, the way the CPS and the census code that information is when you're asked your industry and occupation, that's a free form text field. And then there's a person who's a census coder classifier who has to take what you wrote and they have to classify you to industry and occupation. But one week you might be classified as a clerical worker, another as a word processing or data entry worker, and so on. So you're going to see a lot of measurement, a lot of false changes that are due to measurement error. And so that actually dampens the signal. The wage changes associated with industry and occupation change are actually a dramatic underestimate of the wage change associated with job change, because so many of those are actually false or changes that didn't happen. And so we make a measurement error correction for that in the paper to adjust for that. So here's what we get. Here's the aggregate wage separation elasticity, pooling all education levels, right? And it hasn't changed very much. It goes from 0.6 to basically it's 0.6 both periods. Why are they slightly different? The baseline level has risen a bit, but not the sensitivity. If we then look at high school only, right, we see evidence of steepening. And notice the steepening, and this corresponds to this quadratic point, is at the bottom of the industry wage premium. So people who appear to be in low wage industries and occupations. And again, because we can't use individual wages for this is why we're using industry occupation. So we're estimating the premium associated with industry and occupation and using that as our kind of measure of wage. And if we look at high school under age 40, this is where we see the biggest change. Now, I want to say, I don't think this contrast is discernible at the 5% level. So it's suggestive, but this is not hard and fast evidence. I wish we had stronger evidence. We're limited by power, but it's suggestive of this story. We think it's kind of a smoking, well, I don't want to say where there's smoke, there might be fire.
Can I ask
of course.
A question which might not be directly related to that? It's like, are there a lot of switches to the gig economy, or people coming back from the gig economy back to a regular job arrangement?
Good question. So the one sector we've focused on, I'll show you in just a moment, is the hospitality sector. And there we see large net outflows. The gig economy, unfortunately, in the CPS, people don't report gig work at all accurately. It's really missing. And so you couldn't even use these data very well to sort of answer that question, unfortunately. And of course, many people who work in the gig economy, by some definitions, of course, are not employed, or they're self-employed, I guess you'd say. But anyway, the main thing is the CPS has had a long-standing problem that for non-standard work arrangements, they just don't seem to register. Like, for example, if you work for a temp agency, you may say your employer is the warehouse to which the temp agency sends you, rather than, Kelly Services.
But there would not, appear as job switchers because I'm in the gig economy and I will be sent to a different warehouse every month and I will be seen as a.
So it's not that they're not necessarily, it's not, so let's say you're in the transportation industry.
Yes.
I don't know if you're a gig worker or not. So if you switch from transportation to, personal care, it could be that you switch out of the gig economy and into, working in home health aid work, but I wouldn't be able to tell if that was gig work from these data.
Okay.
We don't see any change among the older and better educated workers. Okay, so let me, Markus, you better give me a schedule because I don't want to.
We can go another 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. That's plenty of time.
But there's one question.
Yeah.
Do you look at high school dropouts versus high school people?
Those are pooled with high school grad.
Okay, you can't separately look at.
We can, and
Okay.
we
There's
have
no
limited
big
power
difference.
for this cut of the data. I don't think you'd see too much.
Okay.
But if we do look at the wage patterns, for example, the wage growth has been pretty robust among high school dropouts or people without a high school degree. Not everyone dropped out. They may have come from another country where that wasn't common, and even all the way up to some college. So yeah, it is present at all low education levels, although we haven't done the gender split, and that's really an oversight on our part. So now we might say, well, what's the payoff to job change? Like, job change is all good, well and good if it gets you somewhere, but that's what we would, that would sort of complete the circle, we think. So here is wage gains conditional on job change, or wage gains. So here are the people who stay in their job. Here are the people who are newly hired, right? So nominal wages were growing, 4 or 5%. Now they're growing at, 6 or 7%. But on average, they're being swamped by inflation among stayers. Among leavers, they definitely are not, right? They're averaging almost 18 log points nominally, with a very steep change, increase. And then if we split this out by high school below versus college plus, what you can see, let me see if I can draw your attention to this. These bottom lines are the stayers, right? And inflation is definitely swamping the wages for the college stayers. It's about even with the high school stayers. Wage growth is much larger among switchers and even much larger still among college switchers. However, switch rates are higher and have risen by more among young high school workers, right? So the conditional on switching, it appears that the wage gains are even larger for college grads. However, they're large for everybody, and young workers switch more in general, and their switch rate has increased by more. So they benefit more from this phenomenon.
And it's generally the case that young, less educated have a higher switching rate in general.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's right. And that's what you see in the first part of this figure.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah. Not much going on with people 40 years and older. So I say, okay, well, where are these wage gains coming from? Right? It's hard because of limitation data, it's hard to know exactly, it's hard to really pin this down. So one thing we can look at is mobility out of different parts of the wage distribution, where we're using, again, your industry wage as a proxy and your industry wage premium. So we know people in mining, people in manufacturing, all else equal, seem to earn more than people in retail or people in restaurants. And the decades of evidence suggests, that's not all illusory. Those are real differences. That aren't just purely, unmeasured skill, in other words. So we look at mobility out of and into the bottom half of the wage distribution, right? So on average, it's risen, the exit rate has risen a little bit, the entrance rate has risen a little bit more. These are not really very qualitatively or quantitatively different. If we look at high school under 40, they always have a higher exit rate from the bottom half of the distribution because they're on the steep part of the age earnings profile. But that's risen, right? It's risen, by about 25%. And their downward mobility rate has not changed, right? So we definitely are seeing net outflows, an increase in net outflows, I should say. If we do this for the bottom quartile of the wage distribution, right, we see everybody, there's an acceleration of movement out of the bottom quartile. That, again, the quartile exit rate is always lower for the less educated, just because, and young, because they're, especially the young, they're on the upward part, but there's been a big jump in the exit rate the escape rate, and no change in the reentry rate. So again, we're seeing, and this is just based purely on your industry. So more people are moving to higher paid industries, higher residual pay, not just higher paid because they have more education.
Oh, these are across industries or within the industry? Or?
These are across industries. So, and this is really reflect what you're saying. Well, why are you doing this? Why aren't you just looking at wages? And it's really because you can't do this at monthly rates using wages because you don't see it.
Yes, okay.
So these are using industry. We do see your industry. We know if it's a real change, and then we can use that as our measure. And then finally, here's the escape rate from the hospitality sector, right? So the exit rate on average has risen. So the hospitality employment among higher educated workers has fallen a lot, but even among low educated workers who are much more represented, we also see a big jump. So there's a lot of evidence that people are moving to higher wage industries. Mm-hmm. But you may say, well, how much does that account for these growth in wages among job changers? And the short answer is, this is for everybody. Let me just focus on the young high school under 40. This is the wage premium that of the industry people are leaving from. This is the wage premium of the industry they're going to. This is the gap. So what this says is there's a very modest increase in they're moving up, maybe a half or a quarter of a percentage point on average when they switch industries. So although on average they are moving up the ladder, it's not very large. It's measurable, it's statistically significant, but it doesn't appear to be a major contributor, at least not the bulk of the gains we've seen.
So most is within industries rather than across.
That's
industries.
right. So that, in our sort of simple story, we'd say, look, you're just moving to a better employer, right? Mm-hmm. With it, you're doing the same thing, but now you're working for a more productive firm. This is not the definitive test of that, but the evidence is consistent with that hypothesis. So just to summarize what we have here, wage growth is faster among young high school graduates than among others. Among young high school stayers, wage growth is keeping pace. Among BA stayers, wage growth is falling short of inflation. The EDE transitions actually appear to be more remunerative for the high educated in a descriptive sense. However, the rate of EDE transition is higher among the young, less educated, and has risen by more. And the premium has risen a lot for both. So high school educated workers are gaining a lot from these transitions. And our evidence is that most of the wage gains are coming from transitions, not from staying in place. And as far as we can tell, it's not mostly coming from moving to higher wage industries per se, although that's part of it. So consistent with this sort of notion of just greater competition, it's plausible that workers are moving to higher wage jobs doing similar work. Mm-hmm. But it is important that they have to move, right? So when people say, well, look, I'm sitting here in place and I'm getting killed by inflation, that's probably true, right? You shouldn't say, oh, no, you're in the bottom quartile, you're fine. You're probably not fine unless you've changed jobs. Okay, so just in the last couple minutes, how much does wage pressure contribute to inflation? So here we're going to estimate price and wage Phillips curves at the state level. And we're going to use price levels from metro areas, 21 metro areas for which they're available. For workers in other metro areas, we'll use the average of state metros, so ones those are not those 21. And for workers in states with no metro price index at all, we'll use the BLS regional price index. So this is just working with the data that are available. So on average, wages and prices are increasing by about the same amount for a given level of tightness. So a 1 unit increase in our standardized measure of tightness is associated with a 1 percentage point growth in both average wage levels and average price levels. Now, of course, the growth is much steeper for young high school educated. It's also much steeper at the bottom quartile. So it's definitely the case that these things are moving in tandem, but the gains are concentrated at the bottom. In fact, if you look at our data, where do we see it? Here you can see it. So here's our estimate for the real wage Phillips curve, right? Here's for high school under 40. Here's for high school 40 plus. So let me just summarize you. Some of you probably don't read as many regression tables as I do. This says that there are real gains among high school under 40 among some college under 40, but among people over 40 and among people with BAs, these are, weakly positive or significantly negative, right? So after inflation, high educated older workers appear to be losing ground. Okay, so we can't reject that labor market tightness has the same impact on local price levels and on mean local wages. It's consistent also with Gatz and Kruger's 99 paper, although they actually imposed that, but it seemed like probably a good assumption. Consistent with this working paper by these two Berkeley students for local prices. Estimates imply that rising tightness contributes about 1 percentage point to post-pandemic inflation. That's just looking at that time series figure of tightness. I don't think that's a very strong test. But it is associated with real wage growth among the bottom two quartiles of workers. So the last question you might ask is, what about inflation inequality? Are low-wage workers subject to disproportionate inflation? Because that would sort of reverse the valence of this story.
Yes.
So I'm going to here just turn to the recent working paper by Xavier Gervais of London School of Economics. And he plots inflation by income percentile, by household income percentile, and you get this inverted U, saying inflation is steepest for the middle class and lowest for low-income households, and then somewhat lower than the middle for high-income households. So you might say, well, where is that coming from? The answer in his data is gas and vehicles. So basically, low-income households don't tend to own as many vehicles and don't tend to spend as much on personal transportation. And so they are not feeling the brunt of those price changes. High-income households obviously do.
Even as a percentage of their expenditure.
That's what his data suggests, and he's working with internal current populations.
But that's US data or that's UK data?
US data, I'm sorry, that's right. He's using the data that is the basis of the current price index within the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So yeah, it's a very striking result.
Typically, we would have expected the opposite. That
right. So you would have said and especially if you said, well, food and rent and so on. So it's not clear. And the other thing about rent, of course, is, are you using imputed rent because house prices have gone up, or actually negotiated, contracted rent, which probably hasn't moved as fast. So the way I read this evidence is, it makes me think that, if I had a prior that the low wage workers were most subject to more inflation, my posterior is, it could be closer to even.
I mean, the other component is, of course, you wipe out the savers of their savings, the nominal savings. No, that's a huge impact too. But that's
right.
Different from that.
That's right. So people are, that's correct. I mean, I guess low-income households typically have very little savings.
No savings, yes.
So, yeah. Okay, so just to summarize, pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about this, by the way, so thank you. For the first time in 4 decades, wage inequality is falling due to rising lower tail. And despite inflation, real wages are rising among young high school grads, among the first and maybe even the second quartile workers. So that itself is, unexpected to me. And I think, somewhat heartening. Especially some of it's real. It's not just, your boat is sinking less slowly than someone else's. It's tempting to attribute this change to tight labor markets, but what does that mean in practice? One view is it's just, we're on a different point on the demand curve. No normative implications to that. But we think that explanation is too simple. We think that, the evidence suggests that competition is intensified, and this distinction is crucial because rising competition means higher wages that better reflect productivity, and higher aggregate productivity is sort of a double dividend if workers are virtuously reallocating to better employers, right? And that wouldn't be crazy, right? When Germany raises minimum wage, we see evidence from Attila Lindner and co-authors that actually people moved out of smaller, lower paid establishments who tended not to survive and moved to higher paid jobs. The next step on this agenda, other than the many helpful suggestions, in addition to many helpful suggestions we received here, is to use worker firm match data to study these changes at the individual local labor market level. And we are working with a major payroll provider to do that research as the second stage of our project.
But it would also imply that actually the market power for the firms is going down compared to the workers.
Yeah.
But it would then imply that the profits are going down for the firms. No? But we don't.
Well, they may have more market power with consumers.
perhaps that has to be overcompensated with the market power of the consumers.
Yeah. So I mean, my Amazon charges suggest there's a lot of market power.
There's a clarification question I would like to know. So how do you define re-entry in the bottom quartile, which in the earlier slide you used?
Oh, sure.
Whom are you including? Obviously, it's always a quarter, if it's a quartile. How is this?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, so we're using the reason it could change is because these are industry bins. And so if an industry grows and it's an upper quartile industry, then that changes. So, and of course, at the individual level, right, there's always people moving out of the bottom quartile, and it's disproportionately, comprised by the young at any point in time. So, but it's true that they should be, and you might say, oh, and I see one thing that's confusing about this figure, I'm not adjusting these, or actually I want to go back to this one.
Well, you
I'm not adjusting these for size.
Bottom 25%, and then you make them move, and then there might not be the bottom 25.
Then they're somewhere else.
Yes. Okay.
But I'm not, what I should do, and we just didn't get around to doing this, is this should be scaled up by a factor of 3, right? Because the exit rate, if the exit rate from the top 3 quartiles is 1/3 as high, that would still be steady state. And here it's slightly different again. There is definitely a net change, but the figure doesn't capture that as accurately as it should. So I appreciate the question. And I can see why that is actually confusing as constructed.
So let me throw in a last question, given that we run out of time.
Yeah.
So you did this for the US. Do you have any inkling how it is for other countries? There also is a tight labor market in many countries in Europe and all this. You would expect similar things, or is that a US phenomenon?
I know. They, in general, my understanding is that, yes, labor markets are extraordinarily tight throughout, the OECD, but wage growth has been much less robust at the bottom, even though inflation has been quite robust. So I think that's accurate for the UK, where I was just last weekend. I think that's true in the Netherlands. The US is behaving unusually, and many things were different about the US labor market during the pandemic. One of them is we threw many more people out of work. Most other countries essentially insulated workers through short time arrangements where they continue to be paid through their current employer, even if they weren't working. And in the US, we actually had policies that encourage separations, particularly the extremely generous pandemic unemployment benefits. So that may be one reason. What we'd like to know, and I think where your question points to, is, has job change increased as much in those other countries? And I don't know the answer yet, though I hope to find out more about that.
Because you would expect, if you're doing the Corona crisis, if you prevent job reallocation because you keep the matches between workers and firms, you might have more changing subsequently.
Well, many people argue the opposite, that the US, broke all these ties.
Yes.
And to the degree there was like firm-specific human capital, or even a relationship capital, that in some sense we've unglued all those bonds. And I think there was a concern that was highly unproductive, right? That actually, that capital was worth something, human capital, and now you've just, wiped off the map. So I don't know.
But then you wouldn't see the wage increase if you have destroyed all the efficiency gains suddenly.
Well, so but I guess the alternative explanation is you reduced all these frictions, right? That were preventing people from reallocating, and maybe the frictional costs were higher than the kind of productive benefits, that people were not at the job that would have used them even more efficiently.
So we have a tradition in this webinar series that we end with a positive note. During your presentation, I don't know, is there any negative aspect to it, or is it mostly positive?
No, for sure. So a few things. One is, the inflation is a very serious issue, and of course it's definitely afflicting people who are in the upper half of the distribution. So that's not a positive. And it's also the case that, if you're not changing jobs, our evidence suggests you're probably not really benefiting from this, right? So it's someone from the bottom quartile, or, a high school age of 40 says, look, I'm just getting screwed. I don't know what your paper's about, Autor. I wouldn't say, well, look at my regression. It says that you're doing fine. I would say, yeah, you probably didn't change jobs, and most people aren't. And so that's not, you very much, if you're staying in place, you probably are losing ground. So I don't think it's I think it's if we're correct that the labor market is behaving more competitively, that's great. But the inflation is not good in any sense. And certainly it imposes a tax on people who are not able to take advantage of those, of the kind of mobility opportunity.
Very good. So thanks a lot. It was really insightful, and I appreciate that you presented, and hopefully, and I also appreciate for all the questions you gave us, and we could pass on to David. And I hope to see you next week again, all of you. And thanks again for David for giving such a great talk.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks.